What I'm about to give you is fundamentally good advice, and whether you choose to use it or not is entirely up to you. It's time for more GeeK Talk. Hi guys, and welcome to GeeK Talk, where we talk deep and geek about everything related to pianos, keyboards, synthesizers, and music production. And today's episode is the pros. They don't care, and why you shouldn't either. Right, so before I jump into the subject, if you're a regular subscriber, you will know how we roll here, but if you've just come to the channel, I'd like to welcome you. And as I say, before we jump into this, understand that if you skip through this video and you take things out in isolation, it will confuse you, it'll probably annoy you, and you will not understand what I mean. So I would ask you to please watch the video in its full duration and in context, and you will understand that there is good intention. And the advice I'm giving you is advice I've attained over the years from people who know a lot more than me. So it's advice I'm passing on to you from some gurus that I've been very fortunate to work with. So, as I say, whether you choose to use it or not is entirely up to you, but please do take the time to watch the entire video. And let's jump into it. Okay, so when I say the pros don't care, or the pros, and when I speak about pros, I will interchangeably use the word pros and gurus. Gurus or pros being people we look up to, people who we deem to be successful producers, mix engineers or whatever. And these gurus or mix engineers that you look up to, they could be great mix engineers like Dave Pensado, Chris Lord-Alge, and Mark Ellis Flood, Gareth Jones. There are tons of them. But these gurus can also be people that you know. I mean, we all know people who we look up to, who we personally have access to. Now, what I mean by this is that in my personal experience, guys, I have been very privileged to be able to be mentored by some really, really, top people, and some well-known and some not. And for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to names drop because that's not what this is about. There is one producer who did sort of show me a lot and teach me a lot, and for the purposes of this video I'm just going to refer to him as Mr. R, because as I say, I'm not going to be doing any names dropping in this video. But what I mean by these gurus or pros not caring is, of course they care, but what I mean by they don't care is they don't get caught up on the silly things. It's very much like that saying, don't sweat the little things. And of course, when it comes to music production and the contents of a mix, of course everything counts, every detail is important. But the knowledge and the information that I've gained from these very great people that I've been blessed to work with over the years, I've realized that they are more sort of focused on the big picture as opposed to the little fundamentals. Now, remaining on topic with what I mean is, let me use an example. Now, this producer that I used to be mentored by, he had a lot of success, and as I say, I was very lucky to be in a situation where I could be mentored by him. And there are many examples, but I'll give you one example that always, I like to use an example to my students when I'm coaching them, and that is, I was in this room with Mr. R one day, and he had just finished a track. He was about to bounce it, and it was going to go off to be mastered. And I was in the room, and we had a great chemistry and a great relationship, so he would often play me his songs, and I would sometimes play him my songs. I was always embarrassed to play him my songs because I wasn't on his level. But anyway, he was a lot more experienced and a lot older. But anyway, so we were in this room, and he had finished this track. So he pushed play, and he sat there, and I stood there, and I listened to it. And he was a great producer, great songwriter, a real sort of all-rounder. And the song was great, and it sounded great. And as experienced as he was, he still valued my opinion. He still wanted to know. He used to call me V. He said, "What do you think, V? Is that good, V? What do you think?" Because as experienced and as talented as he was, he knew that, that it's always nice to get another opinion because he was possibly too close to it. But one of the things I particularly remember from this session was when, as he was bouncing the session, I think it was in Pro Tools or something, I remember looking over at the mix page and saying to him, the master bus, it's clipping. Oh my God, the master bus is clipping. And he turned the volume down and he looked at me. He hit spacebar to stop the session. And he went, what? I said, I said, it sounds great, but look, the master bus, it's clipping. And I never forget what he said to me. He said, Vaughn, how many records have you sold? And that was always our little thing. Every time he used to sort of like shoot me down, but it was a joke. He wasn't sort of arrogant or anything. The point I'm trying to make there is, and what you can take from that, and there are many examples of this, is that this is someone who's had great success, sold millions of records, and he's now bouncing a session here. And here's me, the enthusiast who, by all means, all intents and purposes, doesn't have the knowledge. And as enthusiastic as I was, I'm looking at this session, which sounds great, but I can see the master bus is clipping. And I'm like, oh my God, the master bus is clipping. And he didn't care. He just didn't give a shit. Now, I'm not saying that, obviously, he didn't give a shit. What I'm saying is, and what you can take from this, is that there are many examples of where I've seen this, where these top people or gurus or whatever we want to call them, they kind of just get on with it. They are not focused on the small things that don't matter. I was discussing this with my mate Tom Shear from Assemblage 23 when we did the previous GeeK Talk interview, and Tom and I talked at length. And Tom's a very experienced producer. We talked about how, especially these days, how back in the days before we did our music on computers, you weren't looking at a screen. I find the problem with producers these days is, and myself included, is we tend to be looking at the screen too much and we're not actually listening as much as we should. And I always tell people to turn the screen around or switch it off and actually listen, as we did, before sort of DAWs and music production moved on to computers. But anyway, so Tom and I were talking about how it is so important, and this is something that I even struggle with, is that you actually listen. Because very often, and if you're a producer, whether experienced or up and coming, haven't you often looked at a session and playing it back and you're thinking, oh, it sounds great. And then as soon as you look at your metering and stuff, it's all over the place, like it's clipping and it's in the red. Now, it is very important. I'm not trying to tell you that there are fundamentals that are very important when it comes to making a record and mixing a record. Gain staging and all these things are very, very important. But what I'm trying to point out is that people get so bogged down by the technicalities and oh my God, it's clipping. And of course, for the record, your master bus should not clip, of course, unless you're going for that type of sound. But I see this all the time. And, with up and coming producers, both younger and newer ones, people I'm coaching, they will send me songs that are great, but they can't finish the songs because they're so bogged down on things that are not really part of the big picture. They are so fixated on little things that no one's ever going to hear. And this is why it's very difficult when you're working alone, because in the good old days of music production, you would have, good old days. Well, let's talk about conventional approach. You'd have the band, they'd have a manager, the record label would give them an advance. They would go to a studio. There'd be a producer. There'd be a mix engineer. So you as the artist would go in there just to perform. You'd either play your parts, sing it, and then it would be up to the producer to get the best performance from you. And then the producer would work with a mix engineer, possibly two, and then, the song would be mixed. There'd be another opinion from possibly another mix engineer. It would go on to be mastered. So back in the ideal situation, the artist was very far from the end product. And what I mean by that is not so far as input was concerned, but they had their role. What we have today and thanks to music technology, but it's a double-edged sword, it's a good thing and a bad thing, is the fact that we can do everything ourselves. But with that comes the problem of we're too close to it. If you're wondering who the hell is this guy telling me, guys, I speak from absolute experience here. I coach people and I see this all the time, but I struggle with it myself. And you might go, oh, well, who the hell are you to coach people when you can't figure it out yourself? Well, that's just the point. It is better to actually be coached by someone who falls prey to these mistakes all the time. I don't want to go too much into this, but I'm busy working on my album at the moment. And although I'm perfectly technically capable of mixing my own records, I don't mean that in an egotistical way. It's just that I know how I want my records to sound. Comes back to a saying that Dave Pensado once said. He said, you should not mix to show your skills. You should mix to show your taste. And that's a very, very important phrase. That is something we should talk about in a later video. But the point I'm trying to make is, so I know what I want my records to sound like. However, these days, with everything that's going on, I have realized that it is better to give once I've finished producing it, I will do what I call a reference mix, and I will send it to a mix engineer. And I'm busy using a mix engineer called Sean Kennedy, who I met through my YouTube channel. He's a top guy. He's a really, really good producer. And, I did a lot of research and I decided to use him. And I'm using him because he gives me that that second perspective. And one of the big problems, as when we're working on stuff, we are so close to it. So if you're doing a song and let's say you've got a little synth riff running through going dogga diggy, dogga diggy, dogga diggy. Now you may have spent, I don't know, a week or 2 months, depending how geeky you are, programming that synth riff. And then you're so precious over the synth riff. And then when you start mixing it, you've lost perspective, because as you're mixing this song, your little synth riff, which you're so precious about, you're going, oh, I need to bring that forward. I need to bring that forward. Oh, yeah, I need to bring it forward, because it took me two months or three weeks or whatever to produce. So it's a very important part. I'm very attached to that part. Whereas in the grand scheme of things of the record, that part that you're so tied up on is not that important. And that is why when you give the mix to someone else to mix, they get an open session and they're not precious. They just go, oh, that's too loud. That needs to go back. And you're like, no, that synth part took me 3 months to make. It must come forward. What I'm trying to say to you is, in the grand scheme of things, these things don't matter. This reminds me of an interview I just did with Rich Silverthorne and Mark Hockings from the band Mesh. I went down to Bristol to interview them. And what was interesting was they were telling me that when they did their 2006 album, which was called We Collide, their record company got Gareth Jones from who produced Depeche Mode to mix this album. And what Rich from Mesh told me was so interesting watching Gareth Jones work was the fact that when Gareth got the session from them and started to mix it, he would take elements that the band Mesh thought were very important and he'd push them to the back, and Gareth would take other elements which the band thought were less important, and he would make those elements more important in the mix. And, that comes with experience and stuff. And also coming on to, Mesh talking about working with Gareth Jones, I never forget Richard telling me what was so interesting to them was when they met Gareth Jones. But what Richard said, what was so interesting and mind-blowing, was the fact that Gareth Jones, he just had a Mac. It must have been like a G4 or something back. This was back in 2006. But the point Richard was trying to make was, and the question Richard asked was, where's all his gear? He's only got a computer. Okay, and of course these days that's kind of accepted. But back in 2006 when computers and music production on computers were, well, they weren't in their infancy, but they certainly weren't to the level that they are now. It was just fascinating for the guys to see that this guy's just got a computer. So there's a classic example. Gareth Jones, who is an absolute guru and an absolute legend, he's just got a computer. And I'm sure that if you sat in a session with Gareth Jones, and remember he's got lots of experience, he'd probably work very fast, and you or I as the novice will be sitting there going, oh, what about this? What about this? And he'd probably look at you and go, yeah, it doesn't matter. So what I'm trying to say is, guys, I'm not telling you you should not care. All I'm saying to you is, of course you should care. you should not get bogged down on the little things. And this is why working in isolation by yourself and in small teams is very difficult. And in a ideal world, it is quite nice if you have the resources and the ability to get someone else to finish the record for you, as I do with my mix engineer friend Sean, who is now, as I say, I record, I produce everything, and I will send it to him the way I like it to sound. And then Sean will just take it and he won't change it, but he'll make it better. He will add his creativity to it. And that is what I pay him for and what I trust him for. And that is very difficult to actually find people who can represent your music, the way you want it to sound. And coming back to that session with Sean was, I've just sent him the song and I had recorded the vocals. And what I like about Sean is he's a brutally honest guy. He's an honest guy. If something's shit, he'll just say, that sucks. And that's what I like about him. There's no bullshit with him. But he came back and he went, wow, Vaughn, I really like this. And I was like, oh, thank you. But he said, your vocals, they're about 70% there. You're not singing like you mean it, Vaughn. And I went, okay. Now here's the coach being coached by, a mix engineer. And he's absolutely right. And he said to me, Vaughn, what you need to do is you need to step away from it and then come back to it in a week later. He even joked, he said, get drunk and come back to it with a different, wear a different hat. And that was very valuable. And this is the advice I always give to people is, when you're working on a song, step away from it and come back to it, because you will come back with a fresh perspective. But also, because I've produced the song myself, I'm coming to sing it now. And as I'm singing it, I'm thinking of it as a producer. So I'm singing and I'm thinking, oh, how's this going to... Tons of stuff that is going through my head. I'm thinking, how's this going to relate to that synth line that's coming in? Is it going to clash? Is it going to conflict? And this is why, in an ideal world, the artist and the producer are not the same person. But anyway, the way I got past this was I took Sean's advice. I took a week off. And when I came in to do the session, I had a couple of shots of vodka and nearly a bottle of wine. Now, I don't drink much. I'm not advocating that you get drunk and do things like this, but it did help. It really meant that I walked into the session. I'd set everything up before the time. I had my drinks. I came in. I walked in and I just sang it. And and then I switched the session off. And when I woke up the next morning and I listened to it, first of all, I listened to the parts in isolation and I went, oh my God, what was I thinking? But when I put all the parts together, I liked what I heard. Personally, I did. And I'm very critical on myself. So I thought, let me send it to Sean. And I was a bit like, oh, I don't know, Sean. I was a bit tipsy when I did this. And Sean came back with something like, fucking hell, that's more like it. So thank you, Sean, for helping me get the best out of myself. And what you can learn from that is, guys, you need to put yourself in a different headspace if you're the artist and the producer. And it's very difficult to do. And it's something we talk about. It's something I coach people about, but I struggle with it myself. So I know exactly what it is. And coming back to my saying with, the pros and the gurus and the experts, like my friend, Mr. R, when I say they don't care, of course they care. But what I mean is they don't trip up on the small things. I remember going with my friend, Mr. R, to a conference once. He was invited there. I think it was IK Multimedia, who do some great, sort of mastering stuff. I'm not endorsing them, but they're a great company. And I went along with Mr. R because he was he was a speaker at this event, and he did his presentation, with a projector and everything. And then after the presentation, he opened the floor up to questions. And then, of course, there were loads of people like me and you there, like fellow geeks, and it was a serious geek fest. But anyway, I'll never forget one of the questions this question was asked. One of the people there asked Mr. R, my friend, and they said they were talking he was talking about I think it was a kick drum that he'd been tweaking for about 2 weeks or something like that. And I remember my friend, Mr. R, just saying to him, he had a microphone, and he went, sorry, how long have you been tweaking that kick drum for? And this geek went, oh yeah, about 2 weeks now. I'm just trying to get the optimum bottom end. And my friend, Mr. R, just cut him down and he said, do you have a girlfriend? And the geek went, sorry? Mr. R said, do you have a girlfriend? And the geek went, oh, I don't actually know. And then Mr. R went. And that is one of those moments that really resonated with me, because if we come back to my friend Mr. R, he wasn't incredibly technical. It reminds me of Gary Newman, who we talk about a lot on this channel. I love Gary Newman. I love his music, and I love his sincerity, and I love him as a character. He's just a very honest guy. And the great thing about Gary Newman is he is so honest that he's almost dismissive of himself. And I remember he was being interviewed by one of these, I think it was a music tech magazine or an online one. I can't remember the one. But the interviewer asked Gary, I think it was, I think for his album Dead Sun Rising or one of those. And they said, what gear did you use? And and Gary Newman being the typical non-pretentious, nothing to prove kind of guy, he just went, it's basically all just software, Omnisphere. And I love that, because I think the interviewer thought, oh shit, this is going to be a short interview, because I think the interviewer wanted him to say, yes, I use this modular synth and I plug it into this and I do this and blah, blah, blah. And you know what, guys? I've never worked with Gary Newman. I hope I can interview him one day. But I know from what I've read about him and what I've heard, he's not incredibly technical. And what I mean by that is he makes great records and he's a great artist. But he doesn't, I don't think he's going to sit there and he's not going to tweak a hi-hat for like, you know, for 5 weeks. And then I think he's a creator of sounds. He puts things together and he intuitively knows what works and what doesn't. He does work with Aid Fenton, who is a fabulous producer and takes it to the next level. And that is why I always endorse the idea of individual artists working with, you know, working teams, because, you know, working with someone with common goals and who understands what you're doing can help you take your project and your product to the next level. But talking about Gary Newman, as I say, this is a guy who's just improved over the years. He does great records. And you know what? He's not that technical. He knows what he needs to do to achieve the sound, but he doesn't get bogged down on the technicalities. Now, it depends what you want to do within the industry. My good friend Simon Forsyth, who you guys will see a lot on this channel. I love Simon a lot. He's such a good bloke. He is such a incredibly technically geeky guy. He really knows his stuff. He knows what he's talking about. And I personally, I would put myself in the, I'm not trying to say I'm as good as Gary Newman, but I'm in that field where I know what I need to do to create a record and make it sound the way I want it to sound. And I can write and that is my strength. Whereas my friend Simon, he's more like let's use our friend Alan Wilder from Depeche Mode, or Recoil. Alan was never a great songwriter, although he did write some good songs. His strength was in the soundscapes and the production. Anyway, I suppose that's a completely separate topic, but what I'm trying to point out to you is it really depends what you want to do. You know, like my friend Simon, who's very technical. I'm more of an artist and I suppose a creator of songs. But anyway, but really what I want you to take from this video is, my friends, is if you're not enjoying it and it's not, if it's getting stressful, then you're I don't want to say you're doing it wrong, but you need to step away from it. This needs to be about joy and fun and all these tools and access we have to technology. And this is such a wonderful time to be alive, man. Can you imagine the music that Beethoven and Bach and Mozart and all those guys, can you imagine what they would have done if they had the technology of these days? I mean, one could argue and say they might be distracted by the technology and would not have done the great works that they gave us. But it's a great time to be alive now, guys. And if you're struggling with music and stuff, and this might sound like stupid cliche advice, but it does really come down to, why are you doing it? You know, if you're not enjoying it, stop. But from that, I understand that, you know, when you care about something, of course, you're going to get obsessed with it. And I find that, and a lot of people I'm coaching and people I talk to are very talented musicians, very talented producers. And when I get this stuff, that I'm thinking, wow, this is really good. But they are their own worst enemies. It's like me. I know when I'm working on a record, I'm my own worst enemy. You know, I need to put deadlines in place. Most of the problems we face these days, if it's not crashing software and everything, it's psychological. mind games. And you know something, my friends, once you start getting inside your head and you start second guessing yourself and questioning yourself, of course you need to be analytical, but once you get too much inside your head, you are then behind enemy lines, and that is a bad place to be. Right, guys, so as always, my videos are a lot longer than I want them to be, but when I'm in flow, I just don't apologize for it. So what you really need to take from this is understand why you're doing it. I'm sure you do, because I think we sometimes get so bogged down with what we're doing, we forget why we're doing it. Understand that you've got to love it. Don't beat yourself up to a point that you don't love it. And remember that nobody cares about that piece of music or that piece of art as much as you do. And that's not to say you shouldn't put yourself into it, and you do. It's just you really need to know when to step back and know that the changes you're making when you get to that end result are they going to drive you crazy? Do they really matter in the grand scheme of things? I'm not by any means saying you should stop caring. You should not care and pay attention to detail. All I'm saying is, in the case like my producer friend, Mr. R, and people I've worked with before, and like, if it sounded good, it's good. It's like the GeeK company that make fabulous mic preamps and stuff. Not an endorsement, but they're a great company. Their slogan was, if it sounds good, it's good. If you're listening to something that sounds good, but the screen says it's wrong, trust your ears. Trust your ears, because that is something we've lost, is the ability to trust our ears and to trust our instincts. Guys, I'm really enjoying this GeeK Talk series. Leave your comments below. Let me know any advice you have for the community regarding any of the things we've spoken about now. Have you been in situations where you've been with a guru and you were quite amazed by how they just weren't bothered about the small? They don't sweat the small stuff. They seem to just be like working at the big picture, whereas I find it's the novices that tend, and myself included, we tend to be like, oh, what's that? It's in the red. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Music is listened to it's got to be listened to as a whole. And as I say, the little details are important, but don't lose focus from the big picture. And I think I've made my point. Guys, continue to make awesome music. Leave your comments below. Reach out to me and let me know what you thought of this video. I look forward to seeing you on the next installment of GeeK Talk. GeeK out.